You are listening to the Digital Parent Podcast with your host, Ced Lewis.
Hey parents, welcome to another episode of the Digital Parent Podcast. The media through TV, hip-hop, and social media teaches us that boys are preoccupied with sex 24/7 and they live to be promiscuous and personify some type of player. But on today's show, we have my good friend, Dr. Andrew Smiler, and he is here to talk about the facts. On this show, we discuss his new book, Dating and Sex, a Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. We discuss what boys really think about sex, how boys can say no to sex, and how they can judge sexual consent from their partner. So let's get right into it. But before we do, a quick word from our sponsor, mSpy. Parents, mSpy is the ultimate monitoring tool for all devices. mSpy remotely tracks GPS locations, calls, texts, messages, WhatsApp, Snapchat, web browsers, pictures, and much more. With mSpy, you can also restrict unwanted calls, block websites, or even block apps. Go to mspy.com for more information. Hey, Andrew, welcome to another episode of the Digital Parent Podcast. We're really happy for you to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ced. It's quite a pleasure to be here.
Andrew, we want to first off talk about your new book, Dating and Sex, a Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. What led you to write a book about dating and sex, and why do you think it's important for teen boys in particular to have a sex and dating guide?
Wow, that's a big question to start off with. A couple of years ago, I wrote another book called Challenging Casanova, Beyond the Stereotype of the Promiscuous Young Male. And that's a book full of facts and figures really designed for professionals who work with teen boys. But what I learned as part of the academic research that I had been doing and that contributed to Challenging Casanova was that we as a culture here in the beginning of the 21st century really believe that male sexuality is all about scoring and getting laid and being promiscuous. And it's not at all about relationships. This is not what we used to believe 50 years ago. It's not what we used to show on screen 50 years ago. If you go back and watch older TV shows, that was not the portrayal of male sexuality. But what's happened is that we have bought into our own mythology. So here we are 50 years later, 40 years later, and we teach boys and the folks who date them that guys just want to have sex, when the reality is that the vast majority of guys want their sex to be in a relationship. They want to be having sex with people that they have some kind of connection to and feel something for. And when I looked at the books that are out there for teens, coming of age, talking about dating and sexuality, there's a lot of books that are written just for girls. There's a number of books that are written for both boys and girls. But there's nothing that's really written for boys. And if we believe that boys and girls are raised in somewhat different cultures and speak somewhat different languages, then we need to be talking to boys in a language they understand. And given my background, including my work with teenage boys, it seemed like an obvious thing for me to do, to take that next step and talk to the boys directly and not just talk to the adults.
And how many boys did you talk to?
In preparation for the book, I did not do interviews with boys to kind of get quotes for them. I relied on a lot of the clinical work that I've done over the last 20 years, some of the presentations that I've done to boys, visiting classrooms and in schools and other settings over the last about 10 years since I became a researcher, since I started doing research on this area. And so I pulled from that, and I thought about, how, for some of these topics, how would I talk with a 14-year-old who was sitting in my office, or if I was visiting a classroom, how would I talk to those kids? So that was the approach. This is not, a series of interviews where I draw out interesting examples. This is much more of the, okay, we know that some boys really do fit the Start that sentence again. We know that some boys really do fit the stereotype and go out there and try to sleep around. But that's a minority. It's a small percentage of guys. We know that most other guys, again, want to have partners that they're sexual with. And yet there's another group that, and these guys tend to be more devout religious who want to date, but they only want to date if that's going to lead somewhere. And they're not particularly sexual. Sure, a little kissing and hand holding, but they're not actually looking at intercourse. And so presenting that kind of information based on what we know from the research and presenting it in a way that 14-year-old boys will understand it, that was really the approach for the book.
Now, that's very interesting because the research goes all the way against, the media and pop culture where everything that you see is all about boys being sexually aggressive and promiscuous, especially when you look at, hip-hop music now where it seems like it's programming young teen boys to be hyper masculine and hyper sexual. Do you think somehow kids, especially boys, listening to the music on a consistent basis, they're being kind of coded that way? Or is the research showing you that, yes, kids may be listening to the music, but it may not be having an impact on their behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know that kids are very attentive to the media that they choose. And let's remember that, any given kid is choosing most of the media that they are exposed to. It's not like they take in everything. There's way too much to take in. So they're making choices about what they listen to, what they see. And when we look at, if you think about a genre like rap or a genre like R&B, each genre has its own kind of canon, its own standards. So in rap, we see a lot of that hypersexuality, and it's all about getting laid and bragging about how many women you've been with for the male performers and how hot those women are. But if you look at something like R&B, which is also a black genre, I mean, like 85% of R&B performers are black. It's much more romantic. It's much more relational. There's certainly a lot of suggestion of sexuality going on, but the lyrics are less explicit. The videos are less explicit. They don't have that kind of, two guys and 86 women in bikinis going on. So the boys, whether it's by word or by video, they get very different messages about what male sexuality looks like based on whether they're looking at, say, R&B or rap. So big differences there. And if, you think about what's the impact of listening to 2 or 3 hours of music or watching 2 or 3 hours of video week after week, month after month, year after year, it's really about that cumulative effect, not just, this particular song.
Right. And what's the difference now? Because when we were growing up, Andrew, you had like Happy Days, you had Fonzarelli, who was the player, and
Right.
There wasn't that many TV channels, so you were kind of locked into looking at certain hyper-masculine sexual characters on TV. But now with social media, the kids really have the option to choose what type of media they want to consume.
Yeah, it is certainly a very different world. And one of the things that, they choose, and we as adults, parents, teachers, pastors, whatever, who work with kids can point out to them is which character are you choosing? Like you mentioned Happy Days here. Are you paying attention to Fonzie or are you paying attention to Richie Cunningham? Like, which one of those is the person you want to be and why? More recently, a show like 2.5 Men. Do you want to be Charlie or do you want to be his brother? Oh my God, I dropped his name. Not Barry. Alan, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Charlie and Alan. Which of these guys do you want to be? And if we're talking to girls or, gay men who date men, who do you want to be partnered with? I've seen any number of episodes of 2.5 Men. I'm thinking Charlie's the guy I want to hang out with for a weekend because he's a lot of fun, but he's not reliable at all. Alan's the reliable one. Alan is the one I want to be with for the long term. And we can have some of those conversations with kids about, what's the appeal of this character and what are the drawbacks? What are the appeal and the drawbacks of the other characters? And get them to start thinking about this in a little bit more detail, a little bit more critically, who's the person you want to be and why that person? And what are the good and the bad that go along with that?
Andrew, one of the things I love about your new book is I could tell your background being a family therapist, because you give a lot of great teaching guides and examples for parents that I don't know have ever been published when it comes to teen boys and having sex. And one of the things that you touch on in the book is teaching boys how to navigate being placed in the friend zone by a girl or by a guy. And why is that important?
Yeah. So we have this new word, right? I mean, you and I growing up didn't have this word, friend zone. As researchers, as folks who've been around, we know that there's a lot of similarities between what makes a romantic relationship good and important and powerful, and also what makes someone a best friend. It's that honesty, that reliability, that sense that that the other person has your back. And that's true in both of those kinds of relationships. And because we don't usually teach guys about relationships and how relationships work, and some of the more kind of detailed or nuanced differences between a best friend and a romantic relationship, guys don't necessarily understand why all of a sudden they're romantically and sexually attracted to someone that used to be their friend. And they struggle with how to deal and how to cope when they get told, no, I just want to be your friend. I don't want to be your partner. I don't want to date you. And some of that is that, usually when guys have to cope with something, we tell them really straightforward things like just tough it out or just keep trying. Eventually that other person will come around. Well, that's not reality. That other person may never come around.
That's a good point, because you're going to have like ongoing rejection. So if you're rejected on the front end and you make the decision to be the friend, every conversation that your partner has about their partner, who they're dating, who they're having sex with, is going to bring that rejection up every time that conversation takes place.
Exactly. And then, what we usually tell boys about dealing with rejection is either go do something else or, try again and try harder. But neither of those work if this is your friend and you're going to continue to talk to them and see them. The guys need to talk some of that out, and they may need to kind of step back from the friendship for a little while, a couple weeks, couple months, and then re-engage as friend once their feelings have changed and they've been able to cope with some of that loss, that not getting what they want.
Right. And another huge topic that you talk about in the book is this topic about consent and how do you judge consent. You have the straight, hard, verbal consent from your partner, but then you have like the nonverbal cues, which may be a little bit harder to judge. So, how can parents talk to their kid to ensure that their child is getting the proper consent before engaging in sex?
That's a great question, and certainly this has become a huge issue, and we see it in the news somewhat regularly now. We can make explicit what is said kind of implicitly with body language, and again, we can talk to our boys, our sons about, how do you know if somebody means yes or means no when they don't explicitly say that? So that's part of it. Part of it is that we teach boys to kind of push the limits. And, if you want to try something new with your partner and you think it's okay, just kind of go there and see what happens. And that's the nonverbal request. But we don't teach boys to then pause for a few seconds and wait for a response because their partner may have never thought about that behavior. And we don't teach boys what to do if the situation is ambiguous, where their partner just kind of freezes. And we know that freezing is a reaction that's particularly common to folks who've been sexually traumatized. But we don't teach boys to kind of stop and pay attention after making that nonverbal request. And that's a big thing that they can do. We also don't teach boys that if you're not sure what the response is from your partner, you can then ask and be like, is that okay? It doesn't need to be anything big and formal and, oh, wait, let us pause and have a discussion about this. You can just kind of grunt, okay? And the other person will hopefully respond and respond honestly.
And you know what? I think it's where parents have to be honest and frank with their kids about relationships, about their relationships. Because if you look at the media promotes this hypersexuality, hypermasculinity, where boys in that situation are to be told or taught to be aggressive with their sexuality and kind of like, basically be, very up for it and almost kind of like taking it from a female. But on the flip side, you also have females that have also been taught hypersexuality and hypermasculinity, and they're looking to receive that from the male. So if the male is asking questions or checking in on their nonverbals, that could be a turnoff because of how that girl may be socialized in her household.
Absolutely. There's a lot of potential for both poor communication, but for people making kind of incorrect assumptions about where their partner is coming from. And again, we as a species tend to do best verbally, but you do have to read the other person a little bit. You do have to know if they are kind of more sexually inclined or more sexually adventurous, or if they're more reserved. And you also have to decide if when they say yes, that's a genuine yes that really reflects their desire and their willingness, or if there might be a little reservation there, but they kind of don't want to disappoint you as the guy. And so, maybe I don't really want to, but I'm going to do this to keep my partner happy. And we can have, again, as parents, we need to alert boys to all of these possibilities and help them develop a framework for figuring it out. And also talk to them about, how do you decide who to trust someone and how to trust your partner? And how do you figure out how much your partner trusts you and therefore how honest they're going to be?
And that's what I love about the book, Andrew. This is like next level birds and the bees type of conversation. It's not just about, what is sex. This is about how to navigate relationships, how to navigate dating. That I think is a part that parents kind of leave out or leave up to their kids to just figure out.
Yeah, thank you. That was really the goal, not just what do you do, but how do you understand what you're doing and what your partner's likely to be doing. And really giving boys a framework as they're kind of entering these worlds that they'll be able to build on through the rest of their lives, really.
And one of the things you talk about in the book, Andrew, is teaching boys how to say no to sex. And I think that's very important because, you and I both know tons of men who are paying child support for kids that they really never loved the mother or really even cared about the mother. It was a situation where the mother offered sex. They really didn't want to have sex, so they didn't know how to say no. They went through it. They made a mistake, either had a kid, had an STD because of the pressure of how, we're teaching boys when it comes around sex. How do we teach our kids to tell their partner or tell whoever no and mean no?
Wow, that's a great question. And there's a couple different pieces to the answer. One is really making sure that our boys understand that saying no is an option for them. And again, in the media, there is all of this emphasis on guys just want sex and guys would never say no. And we know that's not the reality. We know that somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 boys have been sexually abused or raped. A study by Brianna French, then at the University of Missouri, that came out in 2014. She reported that about 20% of college-age young men or high school juniors and seniors said that they had been essentially coerced into sex, being sexual when they didn't want to be. And again, some of that is about keeping your partner happy, but some of that is really just feeling like you can't say no for one reason or another. And for all that we teach boys to stand up for themselves and do what they feel is right, We don't do that when it comes to sex. We teach boys that they should want it and they should never turn it down. And turning it down means that somehow they're not a real man or they're not man enough. And that's a load of hooey. So we got to start there. But then we can also talk to boys about kind of that image piece. What does it mean to be a real man? And who's judging you? Is this, the other 16-year-olds that you hang out with? And what do they know about being a real man? Because they're 16, the same as you. And why, if we're going to tell our kids to not let their friends pressure them into, using drugs or being crazy when they're behind the wheel, why aren't we also saying don't let your friends pressure you into sex? At least to our sons. A lot of folks tell their daughters that. So we can do it there as well. We can also start putting pressure on media companies to give us different images of male sexuality. Back in the 1970s, women were very clear with the TV networks. And again, there were only 3 at the time. But women were very clear, like, if you don't give us some intelligent women and some women who have some chutzpah and can do stuff, we're going to stop watching. Right. And all of a sudden, we got this whole new set of female characters that could stand up for themselves. And they weren't just ditzy blondes. But we haven't done that for male characters. And that's a way that we could really kind of change the messages that we as adults see and certainly that our kids see.
And, that's one of the things that kind of bothers me about, going back to the music and hip-hop is that we've seen several movements when it comes to the violence that's being promoted during the music. There's been several protests, several movements, several writing campaigns to put pressure on record labels to stop promoting violence. But there hasn't been anything or any pressure about stop promoting promiscuous sex within the music.
No, there really hasn't been. And again, I think some of that is our cultural ignorance. And again, what I mentioned earlier with we have bought into our own mythology. 40 years ago, we thought everyone was kind of like Richie Cunningham. And that was our default expectation of boys, that most boys were good, clean-cut kids. And then all of a sudden in that show, in fact, we see this switch over to this more promiscuous male style represented by Fonzie. And that's what it's been since. I mean, you can trace the history, and I actually do trace some of this history in Challenging Casanova. You got Fonzie and Hawkeye Pierce, and then we get into Sam Malone, and in some ways the Fresh Prince, and then we can come forward to Charlie Sheen's character, who's named Charlie, to Barney on How I Met Your Mother. And we somehow forget those other male characters. And these are characters we like. We watch them a lot. For the last 40 years, they have been good guys and not just the bad guys. But we haven't complained because we've allowed ourselves to be convinced that that's the norm. And there are other things that feed into that change in perspective. But we need to push back on this idea that guys just want sex. Most of the guys that we know in everyday life and, 40 years of survey data show us that most guys aren't interested in being promiscuous. But we somehow fail to notice that. And we somehow stick to this stereotype that we've created instead of looking at the reality.
Andrew, is there one other tip you think we need to cover when it comes to your book for parents for them to take away?
The one big one for parents is to start using media in particular as a way to talk to their boys and start educating them about both relationships and sexual behavior. At age 10 and 11, most parents still regularly watch some TV or some movies with their kids. And that decreases through adolescence. For most kids and parents, it doesn't go away. But we can talk about the relationships and the sexual stuff that our sons are seeing. And I'm going to pick on some movies here. I'm going to pick on Iron Man. In the Iron Man movies that Marvel has put out over the last couple of years, Tony Stark is promiscuous, and it keeps coming back to haunt him. half of the bad guys, it seems like half the bad guys in those movies are women that he has slept with who now want to kill him. And we can talk about, what message goes with that, what message comes with his relationship in the later movies with Pepper Potts, that all of a sudden he's settling down. And is it realistic to think that someone who is that promiscuous is all of a sudden settling down and just going to be with one woman? And we can get them thinking about some of how these kinds of sexual relationships works in a movie that we know that has a primarily male audience. And also, we can talk about the relationships between the male characters. So and again, this year's movie, Captain America Civil War, we have Captain America versus Iron Man. I mean, those are basically the two teams. Their argument at the beginning of the movie is 2 minutes. By the end of the movie, and I'm going to spoil it here for anybody who hasn't seen it, Tony Stark, Iron Man, has realized that he is wrong, and he goes in and kind of saves, Captain America and the rest of the team. But there's no real conversation about, why don't you trust my judgment on this in the beginning of the movie? It's, this is my position. And this is my position, and they argue, and then they're done. And there's no discussion of, wait, I'm your buddy. We've been together through all this. Why don't you trust me? Why are you betraying me? Why are you going to leave me behind? And then at the end of the movie, there's similarly no discussion about, why have you come back for me? Or are you going to say, I'm sorry? Or is that going to be the beginning of the next movie? So we can talk about those kind of emotional relationship pieces in male-male relationships as well. We don't need to just focus on the explicitly sexual and romantic relationships. And in that way, again, we give boys a fuller view of how relationships work.
Great. Well, Andrew, we really appreciate you being on the show. And where can parents go and find your new book?
Thanks. It's been great to be here. The new book is Dating and Sex, A Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. It's available in bookstores of all types, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores. You can find it online from those venues as well. There's a Kindle version for folks who are Amazon fans. You can also find it directly from the press, which is called Imagination. Not Imagination, just Imagination. So it's available pretty much anywhere.
Okay, and where can fans find you on social media?
They can find me through my website, which is just andrewsmiler.com, and there's a section devoted to all of my books. They can find me on Facebook and on Twitter with just my name. I am at Andrew Smiler on Twitter, and I am Andrew Smiler on Facebook as well. Try and keep it simple.
All right, great, Andrew, and best of luck on your new book.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on the show. It's been fun to be here.
Hey, parents, I hope you really enjoyed that episode with Dr. Andrew Smiler. And make sure you go to our show notes so that you can go and get his brand new book, Dating and Sex, A Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. I think it's such a great read if you're trying to have that conversation about the birds and the bees. And like we talked about on the podcast, this book just takes it to a whole nother level where you really get into more teaching than telling. And as always, please go to iTunes, subscribe to the Digital Parent Podcast. Please leave us a quick comment and let us know what you thought about this episode. Until the next time.